The dead weaving lay on Ithra's counter for the third time in 2 years, and this time, before she could stop them, her hands reached for it. She had refused it twice. Twice the scholars had come to her little silk shop in Port Vale with their careful faces and their wrapped parcel, and twice she had said no without explaining, and they had gone away thinking her difficult or frightened or simply old. They were half right. She was 230 years old, and there is a kind of fear that only the old know, which is the fear of a thing you have spent 2 centuries succeeding at not feeling. But the woman who had brought it this third time was not one of the careful scholars. She was a keeper, a real one out of Christen itself, gray-haired, unhurried, with the stillness of someone who had spent her life around things that must not be dropped, and she had not argued and she had not pleaded. She had simply unwrapped the fragment, laid it on the counter between them, and said, "It was found at the foot of your mountain. I think it has been waiting for someone who can hear it. I'll stand here quietly while you decide." Your mountain, as if Ithra owned it, as if it did not own her. And Ithra's hands, which had been so obedient for 200 years, reached out and took the weaving, and her fingers found the threads, and the threads began, in the only language that had ever been fully hers, to speak. This is what the coastal races never understood about the weavings, no matter how patiently it was explained. They thought reading silk was like reading paper. It is not like reading paper. A weaving does not tell you what happened. A weaving puts what happened into your hands, the pattern under the fingertips, the tension in the threads, the places where the weaver's silk ran thin because the weaver was starving, and for as long as you are reading, you are not remembering someone else's hour. You are standing in it. Ithra stood in it. Dark, stone overhead, she knew that stone, knew its exact voice, the hollow ring of home. Hunger woven right into the thread gauge. A hand, the weaver's hand, steady, so terribly steady, recording by touch in the black because there was no more oil for lamps. And under all of it, running through every line of the pattern like a current under a hull, one enormous quiet feeling that Ithra had not expected and was not braced for. Not terror, not despair. Patience, the patience of people who knew exactly what was coming, and had decided how they would spend the time that remained, and were spending it on this, on thread, on record, on the long work of making sure that what they had been did not go down into the dark with what they were about to become. The fragment ended midline, torn, 200 years in the weather. Ithra came back to her shop and her counter and her hands, and found her face was wet, and found the venom aching at her fingertips the way it had not ached since she was a girl, grief slipping her control like a picked lock, and found the keeper still standing there quietly exactly as promised, watching her with old gray eyes. "It's a date thread," Ithra said. Her voice came out strange. "The fragment, it's marked. It was woven in the 11th year after the world ended." "The 11th year," the keeper said. "Your people held that mountain for 11 years. "I know," Ithra said. "I was on the coast by then, selling rope." She set the fragment down with a gentleness that had nothing to do with its age. "Ask me, keeper, you came all this way. Ask me the thing you came to ask." "There is a room in that mountain full of these," the keeper said. "You know there is, centuries of your people's history and 11 years of their ending in the only language in the world that no keeper can read. I am taking an expedition to bring out what can be carried. I have escorts, a ship, and the best charts that exist, which are poor. What I do not have is hands that can hear." She paused. "I am asking you to come home, Ithra, once, while there is still someone alive who can." Ithra did not answer for 3 days, and the keeper, her name was Sira Aln, and she took a room by the harbor and did not press, waited the 3 days without sending a single note, which told Ithra more about the woman than any argument could have. She spent the days the way she had spent 200 years of days. She kept the shop. She sold practical silk to net makers and dyers. She sat in the evening with the Vethari of Port Vale, a community of 40 in a city of thousands, the coastal remnant of a people, meeting in a back room to speak the old tongue so it would not die of disuse, and she said nothing to any of them about what was folded in oilcloth under her counter. And she did not look at the mountains. That was the practiced thing, the 200-year skill. On clear days you could see them from the Port Vale headland. Every Vethari on the northern coast knew that. Every Vethari knew exactly which streets had a sightline to that horizon and which did not, and Ithra had spent 2 centuries walking the streets that did not. It was not that she couldn't bear the sight, it was worse than that. It was that the sight asked a question, the same question always in her mother's voice. "You were coming back in the spring. Where were you?" She had been 29 when she left, that last autumn before the world ended. A caravan trader, young and good at it, carrying Hollow Mountain silk down to the coast the way her line had done for 6 generations. She was to winter in the ports and come home in the spring with salt and steel and news. There was no spring, there was year 0. And every road home closed behind her one after another like doors down a hallway, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, the interior belonged to the dead, and the mountain was a country away, and Ithra was alive on the coast with a cargo of her mother's silk, and no one left to sell it for. 200 years. She had outlived the ships she'd fled on, the cities she'd first sheltered in, 3 human lifetimes of neighbors. And in all that time she had never once gone back, and neither had any Vethari alive, and the mountain had stood on the horizon of all their lives like a held breath. On the 3rd evening she went to the harbor room and named her price. "I'll come," Ithra said, "on terms, hear them all before you answer. First, whatever we bring out, my people are not petitioners for it. I know how your archive works, Keeper. The world asks Chrisen and Chrisen decides. Not with this. The weavings are ours. If the keepers want to hold them, the keepers hold them the way a bank holds a family's gold. Safe and ours, and read by any Vethari who asks forever without a petition. Second, what cannot be carried out is not to be catalogued and left like samples in a drawer. It's to be left as we find it. That room is not a site. It's a grave that people built for themselves with their own hands, and it will be treated like one. Third," and here her voice did the strange thing again, "if we find weavings signed by the line of a Shan, they come to me. Not to the archive, to me. That is not negotiable, and I will not explain it." Sira Aln looked at her for a long moment across the small room. "The line of a Shan," the keeper said, "your mother's line. I said I would not explain it." "You didn't have to," Sira said, gently, "and let it be. I can agree to all 3. The first will take some argument in Chrisen, and I will win the argument. Knowledge belongs where it's alive, and your people's history is only alive in Vethari hands. Any archivist worth her robes knows that." She said it simply, as if it were the most ordinary scholarly position in the world. "We sail in 6 days. What should I know before we do?" 2 things, Ithra said. "The surveys your society people ran, they went to the front doors. The trade galleries, the great south gate. Of course they found the dead thick there, that's where my people fell back to year after year. The dead are where the living ended, but I was a caravaner, Keeper. Caravans don't use front doors. There's a winter gate on the northeast shoulder, a trade cut, high and narrow, made for packed trains when the passes snowed in. If 200 years haven't shut it, I can find it in the dark. I have found it in the dark. And the second thing..." Ithra was quiet a moment. "The second thing is that I am the wrong person and the only person," she said. "You should have a reader whose hands don't shake. There isn't one. Everyone who could read that room has been dead 200 years except me, and I have spent 200 years being somewhere else. So you'll take the reader you have. But understand what you're bringing, Keeper. You're not bringing a scholar, you're bringing the woman who wasn't there." "I know exactly what I'm bringing," Sira Aln said. "I'm bringing the one who came back." The Confederation coaster put them ashore at dawn on a gray beach below the mountains, and the first thing the mountains did was be exactly as Ithra remembered, which was the cruelest thing they could have done. The silhouette, the 3 peaks and the long shoulder. The way the morning light came off the eastern faces. 200 years of not looking, and her eyes went up the slopes and found every landmark waiting, patient as the dead. The ridgeline she'd watched for as a girl coming home with the caravans, the notch that meant 2 days out, the high shoulder where the winter gate hid. Nothing had moved. Mountains do not grieve. They just keep the shape of what you lost. There were 5 of them on the beach. Ithra, Sira Aln with her document cases and her terrible calm, and 3 keeper field escorts, Fen, a broad, quiet woman who checked everyone's straps twice without being asked, Tam, young, watchful, carrying most of the rope, and Das, older, a crossbowman who had been on retrieval work for 20 years and had the specific silence of a man who had carried things out of bad places before. They saw the wrongness before noon, and it was not the wrongness they had prepared for. The dead were at the lower approaches, as the surveys had said. What the surveys had not conveyed, what perhaps could not be conveyed, only seen, was how they stood. Not scattered, not drifting, the way the dead drifted everywhere else in the drowned world, wandering their slow, purposeless wander until sound gave them a purpose. These stood in a line, a loose, ragged, miles-long line, strung across the mountain's lower skirts at a consistent height like a tide mark, hundreds of them, facing no particular direction, spaced almost evenly, holding position on the cold slopes as if the whole line had been told to wait, and had been waiting for a very long time. "They don't do this," Das said quietly, glassing the slopes. 20 years of retrieval work in his voice, and under it something Ithra had not heard from him yet, which was doubt. "I've worked every coast of this world. The dead gather where the living were, and they drift where sound takes them. They don't hold a perimeter. Nothing holds a perimeter for no reason." "Then there's a reason," Sira said. "What reason?" "I don't know," the keeper said, and wrote something in her small book, and Ithra watched her face while she did it, and the face gave up nothing at all. "And we are not equipped to learn it, and we are not going to try. We came for a room of silk. We thread the line where it's thinnest, we do our work, and we leave the mountain's questions to the mountain. Ithra, your gate. Ithra looked at the line of the standing dead between her and her home, the tide mark of them, patient as everything else on this mountain was patient, and felt a cold that had nothing to do with the wind. Because the dead were not facing out toward the sea, toward the living world they might drift down into, where they faced anywhere at all they faced in, upslope, toward the mountain. She did not say this aloud. She led them northeast, toward the winter gate, and kept the observation folded small and cold in her chest, next to the other things she was carrying and not saying. The winter gate had held. 200 years, and the trade cut her people had driven through the mountain's shoulder was still there under the ice and the rockfall, a slot in the stone barely wide enough for a laden mule, its old sun and thread waymark still cut above the lintel, and the line of the standing dead ran below it, a quarter-mile downslope, thin here, thin as it got. They crossed the line at the last gray of dusk, in a wind that filled the world with moving grass, one at a time, 40 feet apart at the slow, even pace Ithra set, and the standing dead did not stir, and the gate took them one by one out of the wind and into the dark, and the dark took Ithra like a mouth she remembered. Stone overhead, the hollow ring of home. Lamps to a thread, she said quietly, and heard her own voice come back off the stone with the exact voice it had come back with when she was 9 years old. And from here nobody speaks unless the mountain makes them. It carries, it was built to carry, follow my hand. And Ithra of the line of Ashan went home. The trade gallery ran down through the shoulder of the mountain the way she remembered, and everything in it was the same, and everything in it was wrong. The same, the smooth-worn floor, generations of packed trains in it. The waymark thread still strung at the junctions, her people's road signs, silk lines at shoulder height, their knot codes readable to her fingers in the dark. Storage, dwellings, deep road, hall of gathering. The great supports where the gallery widened, each one carved and silk-wrapped in patterns she knew the names of, names she had not thought in 200 years and that came back now uninvited, each one a small ambush. The wrong, the silence under the silence. A Vethari city was never silent. It hummed, looms, voices, the resonance of the stone carrying the life of 10,000 people in a low, constant chord you stopped hearing until you left home and its absence kept you awake in coastal inns. The mountain still carried sound the way it always had. There was simply no sound left to carry. They walked down a throat built for a song, and the throat was empty, and their 4 small lamps and 8 soft feet were the only music the mountain had had in 200 years. Then they found the first of her people, and Ithra learned what the expedition was actually going to cost her. It stood at a junction of the trade gallery, at the waymark threads, exactly where a person would stand, and it was Vethari. She had known, of course she had known. She had said the words on the ship, the dead in there will be ours, and the keepers had nodded gravely, and she had believed she was prepared, and she was not prepared, because knowing is a thing you do with your mind, and this was standing in the lamplight with chitin gone the gray of old bone and 8 dry eyes, and the rags of a weaver's work apron still on it after 200 years. Not a monster, not a stranger, one of hers. Somebody's mother, somebody's neighbor, somebody who had held the line for 11 years and then joined it, and it turned toward their light with the slow, terrible patience of all the dead everywhere, and lifted its hands and the blade chitin at its forearms, the same chitin that slept along Ithra's own forearms, came up into the old first guard of the mountain's defensive forms, because even this the body remembered. I have it, Ithra said, before any of the escorts could move. She had not planned to say it. But the crossbow was rising, and something in her could not permit that, could not allow this woman to be a problem solved by a stranger's bolt. And Ithra crossed the lamplight and did what she had watched the coastal salvagers and roaders do for 2 centuries and had never once done herself. She stepped inside the reach of the dead and took the dry wrist in her hand, and drove her knife up under the jaw with a strength her grief had been saving, and caught the whole light weight of the woman as she went down. She lowered her to the worn floor, the way you lower a sleeping child. Then she knelt there a moment, over the first of her people to be at peace in 200 years, and did the thing that had been rising in her since the beach, since the shop, since year 0. She took the weaver's dry hand, the one that had held a loom, and pressed it between both of hers, once in the old way, the way you took your leave of an elder. Venom sang in her fingertips, wanting out, grief with nowhere to go. She held it. She held all of it. Go home, she said in the old tongue, in a whisper the mountain carried gently away down its empty halls. We kept the words, go home. Behind her the 3 escorts stood very still, and Sira Aln watched with her old gray eyes, and no one said anything at all, because there was nothing to say and the mountain would have carried it. There were more, of course there were more. They learned the shape of it as they descended. The dead of the mountain were thin in the outer galleries. Her people had emptied the edges as they fell back, year on year, consolidating toward the core, and the fighting had gone inward, and so had the dying, which meant the way down toward the great halls was a walk backward through 11 years of a siege. Barricades breached and abandoned in order, each one deeper than the last. Silk defensive works, the anchor webs and drop lines of the mountain forms, hanging slack and gray. And at each fallen line, the dead of the defense, standing their eternal, aimless posts. They did not fight where they could pass, and Ithra's hands in the escort's craft kept the passing quiet wide of the standing figures, feet on the smooth-worn centerstone where nothing lay to clatter, lamps down to a glow at every junction. Where they could not pass, Ithra took them herself when they were hers to take, one at a time, wrist and jaw and the slow lowering, a leave-taking at every one, and her fingertips ached with held venom until the ache was just another thing she carried. "You can't do them all," Fen murmured to her once, the only time any escort broke the quiet, at the fourth or fifth, watching Ithra kneel again. Not a rebuke, almost a kindness. "There's a whole city of them and one of you." "I know," Ithra said. "I'm not doing them all, I'm doing the ones in our path." She rose. "It's a small thing, but I was not here, Fen, for any of it. This is the part I can still be here for, walk on." The hall of gathering nearly killed them, and it was Ithra's fault, and the fault was grief. The way to the archive ran along the gallery rim of the great hall, the mountain's heart chamber, a vault of stone the size of a harbor, ringed by walkways at 5 heights, where 10,000 people had held their festivals and their councils and their weddings under a ceiling strung with light lines. The lamps could not touch the far side of it. The dark in the middle of that hall was the largest indoor dark in the world. And the floor of it, far below the rim they walked, was where the mountain had ended. She had known this too, the way she had known everything and been prepared for none of it. The last stand had been here, the final line, year 11, the fragment's year, and the floor of the great hall was crowded with the standing dead, hundreds upon hundreds of them, her whole people's ending gathered in one room, dim shapes at the edge of lamplight going back and back into the dark. The rim walkway would carry the expedition above and past them, 100 feet up if the expedition made no sound at all. They were halfway round when Ithra's lamp found the banner. It still hung from the third-tier rail across the hall, a festival banner, silk her people's work, the great sun and thread of the mountain woven gold on deep red, and she knew it. Not knew of it, knew it. She had helped weave its border the winter she was 19 in her mother's workshop, all the apprentice lines called in for the honor of it. Her mother pacing the frames, too loose, again, and it had hung in the great hall every festival since, and it was hanging there now over the standing dead, faded and gray-stitched with dust, 200 years after every hand that made it, still keeping its colors in the dark. Ithra stopped walking. Her hand, rising to her mouth, brushed the rim rail's old anchor line. The anchor was 2 centuries perished. It let go. Its bronze ring dropped from the rail, fell 40 feet, and struck the tier below with a single bright clean chime, and the hollow of the hollow mountains, the resonance her people had shaped and named and sung into for 1,000 years, took that one small sound and carried it faithfully, enormously, to every corner of the great hall at once. Below them in the dark, with a sound like a field of dry grass standing up, the floor began to move. What saved them was Doss, and what Doss did was nothing. Every instinct on that rim screamed to run, and the old crossbowman's hand came down on Tam's shoulder before the boy's first stride could land, and held him, iron still, and Sira's hand found Ithra's arm the same way, and the 5 of them stood frozen on the walkway in the dark with their lamps shuddered to nothing while 100 feet below the dead of the last stand woke, and turned and searched. The sound had come from everywhere. That was what saved them, the mountain's own faithfulness. The resonance that carried a chime to every corner carried it from every corner, and the dead below turned to all of it at once, a slow boiling of gray shapes in the black, hunting a sound that had no direction, and the 5 living things on the rim stood in the middle of the ringing dark and did not give them one. It lasted the length of a lifetime, or perhaps half an hour. Ithra stood with Sira's hand on her arm and the banner across the dark and her heart saying its one word over and over, and the word was, sorry, 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 to the expedition she had nearly killed, to the mother whose border work had ambushed her, to the mountain, to everyone, for 200 years sorry. The floor stilled. The dead ran down like tide water, finding its level, and stood, and were patient again. They finished the rim crossing in a slow, silent hour, and in the passage beyond, when speech was survivable again, Ithra turned to the 4 of them to say the thing commanders say, the apology, the nevergen, and Sira Aln shook her head once, before a word came out. No, the keeper said quietly. You will not carry that too, you've been carrying since the beach. It was an anchor ring and 200 years of rot, and it could have been any hand of the 5 of us. Save your grief, Ithra. Spend it where we're going. We're close now, aren't we? Yes, Ithra said, her voice was almost steady. Down one stair, my mother's district, we're close. The Hall of Weavings had doors of banded cedar and bronze, and the doors were shut, and that one fact undid Ithra more than all the standing dead together. Because shut doors meant a choice. Shut doors meant that at the end, with the mountain falling room by room, someone had come here to the archive, to the silk, to 1,000 years of woven memory, and had made it fast against what was coming. Not to save themselves, there was no living in a sealed archive. To save this, somebody had spent their last hours being a librarian. The doors gave to Fenn's prybar with a sigh of old air, cedar dust and the faint mineral ghost of silk, and the lamps went in, and the Hall of Weavings opened around them, and behind her Ithra heard Sira Aln of Chrisen, keeper of the world's oldest archive, 50 years among the most irreplaceable objects in existence, make a small sound that had no scholarship in it at all. The hall rose in tiers like the great hall's little sister, and every tier was strung with frames, and every frame held silk. Thousands of them, weavings in ordered ranks, racked by generation, the oldest high and dim under 2 centuries of dust and the patterns still speaking through it. Histories, lineages, songs, treaties, the whole recorded mind of a civilization, hung in the dark in the language of touch, waiting 1,000 years and then 200 more for a hand that could hear. The keepers stood just inside the doors, the way people stand in holy places. Ithra walked in the way people walk into their grandmother's kitchen, past knowing, on feet that remembered. The old records are the high tiers, she heard herself saying. Founding lines, the deep histories, your scholars will want those and they've kept this long. But that and her lamp found the hall's lowest tier, nearest the doors, where the frames stood newer and denser and less orderly, crowded in, doubled up, filling every gap. That is not archive order. That's wartime. Those are the last ones, that's the siege. They had woven it all. That was what the low tier held, and Ithra moved along it with her fingers on the threads and read her people's ending in the only first-hand account of the world's ending that existed anywhere in any tongue. Year 1, the passes closing, the caravans that never came back, and she stood in a weaver's steady hands recording the names of the lost traders and had to stop because one of the woven names was hers. Ithra, line of Ashan, wintering on the coast, counted among the dead. Of course. Of course they had, mourned in year 1 by the very hands she had spent 200 years imagining blaming her. Year 2, the gates holding. Year 4, the great sortie that failed, 40 names. Year 6, hunger arithmetic, the deep farms, the light lines going dark corridor by corridor to save oil. Year 8, the outer galleries surrendered, and a weaver recording, in thread gone thin as the rations, the strangest of all the strange things in that hall. The dead do not tire and do not lose interest and do not go elsewhere, the weaving said. Ithra translated it aloud slowly for Sira's racing pen. They besiege us like a task they have been set. The old ones ask, set by what? We have no answer. We record the question. Set by what? Sira repeated softly, writing. They asked it too, 11 years inside the thing itself, and they asked exactly what we ask, and they had nothing, even here, even them. She looked up at Ithra. The answer isn't in this room, is it? No, Ithra said, with her fingers on her people's last question. The answer isn't anywhere, keeper. That's what this room is. 11 years of the best witnesses the world will ever have, writing down everything they saw with their own 8 eyes, and what they saw was the what and the how and the who and never once the why. The mountain doesn't know why. The mountain only knows what it cost. And that, though neither of them said it, was the expedition's true cargo already, not an answer, a record, the difference between a world that ended in silence and a world that ended witnessed. She found the line of Ashan where the archive's order said it would be, and her mother's hand was everywhere in it, and the last frame in the family rack was small, and new crowded in at the end, and it was signed with 2 marks. The loom mark of Ashan, Master Weaver, and beneath it a second knot Ithra had not felt in 200 years, the little crooked personal knot her mother tied into private things, kitchen things, mending, the knot that meant not for the archive, for us. And below the marks, woven into the header where a formal weaving would carry its subject, 4 words in the old tongue. For the one away. Ithra stood in front of it for a long time. The keepers had withdrawn without being asked, taking their lamps to the far tiers, leaving her one light and the quiet, and Sira Aln's voice came once softly from across the hall. There's no hour we won't wait, Ithra. It has waited longer for you. 200 years she had carried the question. You were coming back in the spring. Where were you? 200 years of walking the streets without sightlines, of the held breath on the horizon, of being the one who wasn't there. Every year of it had ended here, at a small frame in a dark hall, at her mother's kitchen knot, and the last thing left in the world that Ithra was afraid of was 3 feet of silk. She took the weaving in both hands, and her fingers found the first thread, and her mother put what happened into her hands. Year 11, the Hall of Gathering, the last weeks. Hunger in the thread gauge, silk spun from a starving body and spent on this. Dark, the light lines gone, a weaver working by touch alone and the touch still master steady, too loose again, 60 years of too loose again in every perfect line. Around her, encoded in the weaving's ground pattern the way her people wove context under content, the sound of the hall, not screaming, singing. Low, unhurried, the old festival rounds, 10,000 voices gone down to hundreds and the hundreds still keeping the harmonies, because the mountain carried everything and they had decided at the end that what it carried would be song. And then the content, the message, the thing a dying master weaver had spent her last silk to say to a daughter she had no reason to believe was alive, and it was this. We counted you lost in the first year, I unraveled it. I have rewoven you living 11 times, once each spring, and I will not be here to weave the 12th, so hear me now, wherever the thread finds you. You are on the coast. You are selling rope or silk or salt, and you are alive because you were always the one of mine with the sense to be where the roads were open. Daughter, the roads were closed. Hear it in my hand, you know my hand doesn't lie in thread. The roads were closed by year 1. Nothing that loved you could have reached us, and nothing that reached us would have changed 1 hour of what came. You did not leave us, you survived us. These are different weavings. Do not spend 200 years confusing them. You are Vethari, child, you have the years to waste, and I know how you would waste them. Ithra laughed, alone in the dark heart of a dead mountain with her mother's silk in her hands, tears running on chitin. She laughed because 230 years old, and her mother had still caught her at it, had reached across 2 centuries and a closed grave, and caught her daughter red-handed wasting exactly the years she had been told not to waste. The weaving had a last line. The threads went thin and thinner, the hands steady to the end. We are not afraid tonight. We were a people who wrote in thread because thread holds what paper cannot, the hand itself, the warmth of it. Whoever reads this holds my hand. So I am holding your hand, my daughter who lived. The mountain is singing, the work is done. Come home once so the silk can tell you, and then go and be alive loudly somewhere with the sun on it. Weave your own before the end, sign it with my knot. Ashan, master weaver, line unbroken. The silk ended. Ithra came back to her hands and the hall and the one lamp, and she knelt there holding the last thing her mother ever made, in the grave her people built for themselves with open eyes and singing, and let 200 years go through her and out. The venom did not sing in her fingertips. For the first time since the beach, her hands were quiet. Line unbroken. I hear you, she said in the old tongue to the hall, to all of it. I came home. I'm going to go be alive now. That's the last order, and I'll keep it. They packed through the deep night hours. The siege record entire, every frame of the low tier. The founding line Sira wept over quietly and efficiently, lineages, songs, as much of a civilization as 5 backs could carry, cased in oilcloth and webbed tight with practical silk from Ithra's own store. The line of Ashan's rack she packed herself alone, and no one offered to help, and that was the escort's own kind of gentleness. The mountain let them work. The mountain did not let them leave. It was the great hall that turned them. The rim walkway's far arc had a new voice when Das scouted it, a grinding under the stone that his 20 years read as settling rock and coming collapse, and no one was willing to carry a civilization's memory across a failing ledge above that floor, which left the winter road's long way, the old freight stair, down through the storage districts, out at the mule yards below the trade gate, down then out, through levels no one had scouted. The freight stair was clear, the storage district was not. The dead were in it, not the sparse outer gallery dead, but a fallen defensive line's worth, thick among the pillars of the mule yards between them and the gray pre-dawn slot of the winter gate. And behind them, up the freight stair, the grinding of the great hall's slow collapse was spreading, and the mountain that carried everything was beginning to carry that, and the standing dead of the storage district were waking to it, head by head, before the expedition's eyes. There was one way over the mule yards that was not through them. The loading gallery, a stone shelf along the yard's high wall, its old freight lines long rotted 40 feet of gap where the gallery had fallen, spanning the thick of the waking dead, 20 feet above their reaching arms. 40 feet of gap, and one person in the world who could bridge it. Ithra, Sira Aln's voice was low and even, doing its arithmetic out loud because there was no time for gentler. Your silk, a line across the fall, fen anchors, we sling the cases, we cross by hand. Can you produce that much? Yes, Ithra said, and did not say the rest of it, and Sira Aln, keeper of irreplaceable things, read her face by lamplight and said it for her. It's your memory store, the keeper said quietly, the silk you've been saving. For my own weaving, Ithra said, 2 years of production laid down slow. An old woman's last weaving takes more silk than a young one's, there's more life to hold. It's most of what I have left in me, keeper. Spin it into a freight line tonight, and I'll be years replacing it, and I don't. The words were simple and enormous. I may not have the years. The dead were waking below, the mountain ground on above, and in Ithra's pack against her spine, her mother's hand said what it had said in the dark of the archive: weave your own before the end. And if it's not spun, Ithra went on before Sira could take the choice from her, then the siege record goes back through those yards on 5 slow backs, and some of it and some of us stay in this mountain, and my mother's people sang 11 years into silk that rots in the dark forever. No, there's no weighing here, keeper. My people spent their last silk so the record would live. It's a line unbroken or it's nothing. Fen, find your anchor. I need 10 minutes and something to sit on. This will hurt. It hurt. She sat against a pillar in the lamplight with her forearms bare, and drew 2 years of saved life out through the glands thread by thread while the dead woke below her. And it was the hardest labor of a long life. And she did not stop until the coil at her feet was 40 feet of freight line and the reserve inside her was down to remnants. And then Fen set the anchor and Doss's crossbow carried the light line across, and the last silk of the line of a shan went taut over the mule yards of the hollow mountains. And it held. It held Tam and the cases and Fen and Sira and the whole recorded mind of a civilization, hand over hand above the reaching dead, in the grinding dark, one at a time, out. Ithra crossed last, on the thread of her own unmade memory, and did not look down, and the winter gate took them one by one into the gray morning, and the mountain closed its voice behind them, and it was done. They came down to the gray beach with the sun rising behind the peaks, and past the tidemark line of the standing dead, still standing, still patient, still facing their unexplained inward, and the coaster's boat found them at the waterline, and Ithra of the line of Ashan sat in the stern among the oilcloth cases and watched her mountain grow small across the widening water and looked at it the whole way. 200 years of not looking done. It was only a mountain now. It was only home. Sira Aln settled beside her, notebook shut, and was quiet a long mile before she spoke. I'll tell you what happens in Christen, the keeper said, so you don't spend the voyage bracing for a fight you've already won. The founding lines and the histories go to the archive under the terms you set, held in trust in your people's name, read by any Vethari who asks forever, no petition. I'll stand in front of the council and say what's simply true, that a record in a language only 40 living people can read is not the keeper's knowledge to ration. We're not its owners, we're its shelf. The siege record, too, with one amendment I'd ask rather than order. I ask it. Copies, Sira said. Woven copies made by Vethari hands held by the Vethari communities themselves, Port Vale, Akira, Orvath, wherever your people gather, paid for by the keepers as commission work at master rates. She looked out at the water. Archives burn, Ithra, institutions forget what they're for. The only history that's truly safe is the one that lives in more hands than anyone can close. Your mother knew that, it's why there was a low tier at all. I'd like the keepers to fund the lesson instead of merely shelving it. Ithra studied the old scholar for a moment, the terrible calm, the gray eyes, the woman who had waited 3 days in a harbor room without one note, and thought, not for the first time, that there was more under that stillness than one archive's worth of loyalty. She did not pursue it. 200 years teaches you which stillnesses to leave be. The communities will want to know why a keeper argues against her own vault's monopoly, Ithra said. Tell them she's old, Sira said, and fond of things surviving. On the third night of the voyage home, in the lamplight of the coaster's little cabin, with her mother's weaving hung where she could touch it and her forearms still aching to the bone, Ithra sat down with the remnant of her silk, the little that was left, enough for a first panel, no more, and tied off a header knot and began. Not the last weaving of a woman putting her years in order. She had spent that silk on a freight line over the reaching dead, and it was the best spending she had ever done. This was only a beginning, a first panel, to be added to spring by spring, for however many springs she had, replenished thread by slow thread the way everything worth keeping is. She wove the date first, the way her people always had, year 200. Then the header, and her hands knew the words before she did. For the ones away, there will always be ones away. This is so you will know. And she signed it before one line of the story was woven, so that whatever happened it would carry the marks, the loom mark of a shan, and beneath it, small and crooked and exactly right, her mother's kitchen knot. Line unbroken. The mountain never told them why the world ended. Ithra had stopped needing it to somewhere in the dark of the archive hall, with her mother's hand in hers across 200 years. The why was still out there, in whatever kept the dead standing patient on the cold slopes facing in. Let the scholars have it. What the mountain had given her instead was the who her people had been, how they had faced it, what they had spent their last silk on, and the who, it turned out, was the thing she had actually been starving for all along. She wove until the lamp burned down, an old woman with quiet hands on a small ship on a dark sea, going home the long way, alive loudly, with the sun coming.